Welcome back to Wellness Wisdom. Today we're going to be talking about anaerobic training. So that could be like sprinting, resistance exercise, and how we can maximize the benefits. And essentially, anaerobic training occurs at a high intensity. So what I mean by that is normally when you're walking or if you run a marathon, you're using your aerobic system, which means with oxygen, because it's at a low enough intensity where you don't have to recruit like glycolysis and other things that need like lactate to produce energy for you. So that could be like a 100-meter sprint, deadlifting for 5 reps at a heavy 80 to 90% of your 1 rep max, or even like an Olympic competition like a javelin toss. To receive the benefits of anaerobic training, so those are high intensity exercises, we'll discuss the principles behind that and how we can change those factors. We can change the underlying principles to get the desired adaptations we want. So first we're going to talk about neural adaptations to resistance training. So it's interesting because many people are surprised to learn the first adaptation you get from training is neural, because you walk around, you see people like Arnold Schwarzenegger with their big biceps, their chest muscles. That's hypertrophy, and that's actually not the first thing that happens. So your nervous system adapts pretty quickly, faster than your muscles. So that's what I'm talking about. An increase in neural adaptation occurs in the first 6 to 10 weeks, and hypertrophy takes over as the primary adaptation after that. So what do I mean by neural adaptation? So we have our central nervous system, which is our brain and our spinal cord, communicates to our muscles in the periphery. So we have movement. So we think about moving, we want to walk. So the signal is going to go down from our brain, from the primary motor cortex to activate the muscles in your legs. So anaerobic training can actually adapt the spinal cord to activate the fast twitch muscle fibers faster. And this happens in a couple of ways, which we'll talk about. So this adaptation happens by increasing the firing rate of those neurons, so you get more electricity faster to your muscles. And this is going to release calcium into the cell and cause a stronger muscle contraction and a bunch of other things like that. Motor learning and synchronization, and also agonist muscle recruitment. And I know there's a lot of sciencey words, but we'll try to pick them apart. So motor learning, how you communicate with your muscles, with your brain, is through motor units. So one motor unit is just a neuron, and it innervates muscle cells. And when the motor unit is activated, it contracts the cells. So synchronization is basically the idea of that process being more efficient. So those motor units will fire so that they're efficient to produce the movement. And that's kind of the concept of motor learning. Also, an agonist is in the concept of a bicep curl, where you bend your arm. The muscle that's doing that is your biceps brachii, and that's the agonist. So it's the primary mover. The antagonist would be your triceps, which functions to extend the arm. So when we do resistance training, we're kind of making that movement more efficient. We're learning how to use our body in the most efficient, less energy required way possible. So in the untrained population, only 71% of muscle tissue is actually activated during a maximal contraction, which is crazy. So 30% of your muscle, if you don't train, can never be activated because you haven't learned how to use it yet. So by learning how to fire your neurons efficiently, this makes up the bulk of early training adaptations. So this is a big part of how we can adapt, but there's many other factors, which we'll get into. So the next thing is inhibition of the Golgi tendon organs, GTOs for short. And these are inside the tendons of your muscle. They're sensors that relax the muscle when the tension is too high on that tendon. And this prevents the tendon from actually tearing. So if you can imagine holding 200 pounds in your hands and your bicep is contracting like crazy and you're not adapted to deal with that load, your GTOs will inhibit the tension by causing the relaxation or, just your arm to straighten, drop the weight before it tears. So progressive overload which is the concept of adding a little bit more intensity, more volume, more stress every single week, is a pathway to overload this GTO response. So we can adapt this GTO to allow us to lift more weight over time, because our tendons, our cartilage, and our muscles will hopefully adapt to hold more load as we train in an ideal world. So nervous systems, your nervous system still adapts through like frequency and summation, and this is an important concept to understand. So like when you want to move, your brain sends electrical signals, right? And with anaerobic exercise, there's an increased frequency of these electrical signals. And I said before, this causes calcium to be released in the cell more. And why is that? So with one action potential, which an action potential is just a stimulus of electricity going through your body to your muscle tissue, one action potential can summate. So that means if there's one action potential, it releases a pulse of calcium in the cell. If there's two action potentials, the sum of the total of the two action potentials causes a greater response to calcium. And calcium is how our muscle cells contract. So the sliding filament theory with myosin and actin, it causes them to interact and create a stronger force production. So by learning how to fire those action potentials faster, we can produce more force. And next is the size principle. This is important because it makes us specific to the task that we want to achieve. So motor units are recruited in the order of size from smallest to largest. So motor units are not all equal. So we have small, like 1 to 4 fiber motor units in our eyeballs because it's very precise, very, just tiny muscles. So we don't need a ton of innervation. And those are very small. Then we have large motor units like the ones in your quadriceps that you use when you sprint or when you squat. And walking or sitting will recruit small type 1 slow twitch muscles innervated by like smaller motor units. And when you run a marathon, you use your type 1 soleus muscles to produce low forces for a long time. And sprinting or deadlifting will require the recruitment of larger fast twitch type 2 motor units. And as you exercise, what you do is how you adapt. So selective recruitment is skipping low threshold motor units to fire larger threshold units, which just makes it more efficient depending on your goal. So this may occur when you want to perform at a high speed, so it can be selectively trained through the principle of specificity. And the principle of specificity is essentially if you have a goal in your physiology, so you want to get faster, you train with speed and your adaptation is speed. So we're all about intentionality here. So all muscle fibers will hypertrophy because motor units are recruited in an order of their size. So slow, then fast. Though advanced lifters can obviously override this and activate motor units non-consecutively by skipping the smaller ones. And as muscle size increases, there's also less neural activation required to lift the same load, which is cool because you can lift more weight with less neural strain, less neural activation required, making you more efficient. So something cool. Next is the neuromuscular junction. And this is a very important concept because this is how your motor units, your neurons, interact with your muscle cells. So it's a space between the nerve and the skeletal muscle fiber. And there is things like acetylcholine that are released into this junction, and we can adapt it, believe it or not, with training. So it can actually increase the total area with both high and low intensity training and greater in-plate perimeter length and area, causing acetylcholine receptors to basically be more larger and efficient after 7 weeks of training. And this is just to say you get more neuromuscular junction adaptations as you train, which is a good thing. Myotatic reflex. So this is another reflex, and you probably know what I'm talking about because you've gone to the doctor and he has hit you with a hammer on your knee. Your knee has hopefully done a little jerk reflex, which is to activate your quadriceps muscle, and it uses connective tissue as well. So this is actually a very efficient way to produce force without additional energy. It's very efficient. And resistance training has been shown to increase the potentiation of the myotatic reflex by 20 to 55% in bodybuilders and weightlifters, again, making this more efficient neurally. And one of the ways we look at muscles in the literature is electromyography, the EMG. And this is where surface pads, you just place them on top of anywhere on your skin, and it can measure the muscle activation under it. So intramuscular needles are obviously more accurate because they go into the skin, and when your muscle fires with an electrical potential, the computer senses that. So we can observe changes in EMG activation with training. So training reduces antagonistic muscle activation. Like I said, when you're trying to curl a weight up, your biceps is the agonist. So it is facilitated more, and the antagonist shuts down. And this is important because it shows us that training is actually doing something important for us. And a plateau may occur because accommodation to the training stimulus happens. And this is why the principle of progressive overload will allow that continual neural activation. So neural factors are important for strength gains in programs with higher than an 85% 1-rep max, because your primary adaptation is the recruitment of the muscle, not necessarily gaining more muscle. However, that's also important. So finishing up with neural, we have cross-education. And this is a very interesting concept to me, at least. It's basically the principle that states that exercising muscle asymmetrically produces strength and neural activity in both muscles. So if you only curl with your left weight, if you curl weight with your left arm, your right arm will receive a neural and a strength facilitation. And this suggests that a central neural adaptation accounts for a significant amount of strength adaptation, which is really cool, because if you are post-stroke or something like that, and you just train one side, that means your central nervous system, that neural drive, can improve. Super cool. Bilateral deficit is the concept that force produced when both limbs contract together is lower than the sum of forces contracting by themselves. So that's saying the total of the left contracting and the total of the right contracting is greater than doing it at the same time. And this can be trained. So an increase in voluntary contraction of the agonist muscle groups can occur and reduce this deficit. So that's just the neural drive, central nervous system, the motor neuron pool. You have more drive to put into your muscles, essentially. And next, we're going to discuss the muscular adaptations to resistance training. And this is pretty cool because this got a lot of people into resistance training to exercise. I know it was a driver for me. And the scientific way to discuss it is through the lens of hypertrophy. So hypertrophy is simply the increase in cross-sectional area, CSA, with resistance training. And this is just how we get bigger. This is how our muscles grow. And this is the principle that bodybuilders use to grow. Hypertrophy occurs when there is more production than destruction of actin and myosin in the muscle fiber. So this is all to say that we want to increase the amount of protein that we create and minimize the amount of protein that we destroy. That's how we grow. How can we control this growth? The body is very careful where it invests energy. It prefers to obviously conserve precious resources because the brain and the heart keep us alive. So we want to store energy as fat, and we want to just lay on the couch, just relax. We don't want to build muscle. It's expensive. So in order to convince the body to spend valuable resources on building muscle, we need to implement a sufficient threshold of intensity that must be reached before our body's like, okay, this is reasonable. We should build some protein today, build some muscle today with protein. And this is why moderate to high intensity is needed to stimulate a change, and we will need to intentionally expose our muscles to time under tension. And this is because of a couple of factors, but think about wanting to perform the movement as safely and as slowly as possible on the way down with the eccentric portion. So we will not speed through the repetition. We will control both the concentric and the eccentric, which just means the concentric is the way up. So when you curl your arm up, when you bend your arm, and then the eccentric is on the way down. And we want to control the movement because when we fight gravity on the way down, we have that stimulus to grow. We get tension in our muscles. And when we use the full range of motion, we should, when it's safe to do so. This means we will not stop the exercise short. We'll use the full available range of motion to stretch and shorten the muscle. And this is to say that some people will tell you, oh, you won't only want to use mid-range of motion, or you want to do less than your full range of motion because it's safe on your joints. I'd argue if it's not safe on your joints, you just want to decrease the weight so that you can perform the full range of motion safely before you progress. And progressive overload should be no more than 10% a week. So beginners should start out with about 1 to 2 sets of 10 repetitions and slowly build over time. This might take years for some people. It might take months for others. So personally, I like 3 to 4 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions per exercise. That's a lot of volume, but it also is safe because I've been doing it for so long and I followed the principles of progressive overload. So 10% each week in terms of volume. So listen to your body for signs of overtraining, pain, or excessive fatigue, because the only person who can fully understand how your body feels is you. So start with body weight, light weights, or an empty bar. Go to a trainer, look at YouTube videos, ensure that your form is correct before you progressively overload. And this is to ensure we can lock in the correct movement patterns with motor learning so that when we go to add weight, we're flawless. And all that's going to do is make you more muscle in the future. It's going to make you healthier in the long run. So that's my soapbox. So a relatively short rest period between 30 to 60 seconds is preferred for bodybuilding hypertrophy. Longer rest periods, however, should be implemented. Obviously, 1 to 5 minutes should be done for larger, heavier movements. This is because things like creatine phosphate and glycogen take a long time to recover in your cell. So if you're trying to maximize performance, obviously take longer rest. If you're trying to stress your body, shorter rest periods. So this is all because mechanical deformation, so basically tension on the muscle, stimulates the machinery inside the cells to actually adapt to that stimulus. And signals increase when fibers contract. So this means that when we work out, we're going to increase muscle protein creation in a process called myogenesis with that stimulation of tension. So resistance training downregulates inhibitory growth factors like myostatin, which just basically keeps us, we don't want to grow if that myostatin is released. That some of these intracellular changes causes protein synthesis after 48 hours when we lift. And so this protein synthesis window of 48 hours is where we need to really understand the things outside of training. So growth is multifactorial. That means that nutrition, intensity, hydration, and hormones, they all need to be considered when we are trying to grow. And with heavy resistance training, fast myosin chains will replace other proteins within a few sessions, right? But true hypertrophy takes longer than 16 workouts to see growth. I would say it's going to take longer than you hope it would. So just keep at it. Try to get 1% better at all these things: nutrition, hydration, sleeping 7 to 9 hours. All of those things are going to be voting, so your actions can vote for whether you want to grow or whether you want to stay the same. So things to think about. And we're just going to discuss some things related to muscle hypertrophy. So eccentric training, as I stated before, is the lowering or downward phase of a movement. So the inclusion of eccentric training allows for greater force production, which causes more adaptations. So for instance, I cannot perform many pull-ups. I'm 250 pounds, 6'6", just big dude. So it's hard for me to do pull-ups. So I implement the downward eccentric phase, which causes me to do more repetitions to provide more stress with less overall volume, so I can get the adaptation of doing pull-ups without being able to truly do them for many reps. So metabolic factors, so metabolism happens in your cells, keeps them alive, and when we perform resistance training, our metabolic system gets stressed. So low to moderate intensity with high volumes and short rest intervals will produce a ton of metabolic stress. And this is great because metabolic stress adapts the glycolytic system, which is a system that we use when we are at high intensity. And this volume is about 3 to 5 sets of 10 repetitions with 30 to 60 seconds rest. And it will not maximally, but it will metabolically stress the tissue to stimulate that growth that we're looking for. And this is hyperplasia. Hyperplasia is the concept of the number of muscle fibers actually increasing in your cell. So whether or not this occurs in humans has been debated. However, it has been shown to occur in animals, but if it occurs at all, it's not the primary response. So fiber size is what we think actually increases. So not all motor units are composed of the same fiber type. So the extent to which a muscle will change depends on the genetics of if it's a type 1 or a type 2 muscle fiber. Because slow twitch type 1 fibers are smaller. They are used for aerobic endurance and postural muscles like your soleus or your core musculature that keeps you upright all day fighting gravity. Those are slow twitch, low force production over an extremely long period of time. Fast twitch type 2 fibers hypertrophy more than slow twitch type 1 muscle fibers. And what's interesting is your genetic makeup largely determines what proportion of type 1 to type 2 fibers your body has. So that's why not everyone is going to be an Olympian. It's why not everyone's going to play basketball or football, because some of it is up to genetics. However, we can actually transition our fibers with training, which is great news for us because we would like to be able to be specific about how our muscles are performing, and we can change type 2X fibers to change to more type 2A fibers to become more oxidative. So high intensity resistance training and aerobic endurance stimulate the change from 2X to 2A. Detraining causes the opposite effect. So type 2As are replaced by type 2Xs. So this is a bad thing. So with training, we want type 2As, just better force production. It's more sustainable. Next, we have pennation angle. And this is like the feather appearance. If you've seen a bodybuilder, they flex their delt muscle. You can see the muscle fibers are not just straight forward and back. They're kind of feathered out. And greater pennation occurs with more resistance training. And this happens because proteins in cross-sectional area can be greater with more pennation, because instead of being just linear, the muscle fibers are kind of stacked on each other a little bit more. So you get more force production with less length. So metabolic muscle adaptations can also occur. Inside the body, we have many adaptations to improve our resilience to training. And inside the muscle, it's no different. So there is an increased so inside the muscle fibers, the volume increases. In the cytoplasm, we have increased density of things like sarcoplasmic reticulums, T-tubules, sodium, potassium, ATPase, increases activity. We have enzymes, calcium release, all support force production, and protein making machinery is upregulated. This is great. So specific examples. Sprinting increases calcium into the cell, which is obviously great for force production and cross-bridge formation, which is good for specificity. So if you're a sprinter, sprinting will make you a better sprinter. So bodybuilding produces metabolic stress, increasing hydrogen ions, which is acidic. So when we do that, we stress the system, we circulate it around, and we buffer that acidity. And buffering can actually increase with upregulation of protein enzymes to reduce that acidity. So that's just specificity all over. So whatever you're doing, whatever training you're doing, you're going to have a specific adaptation to that stimulus. So we have creatine phosphate, which is what we use for very quick activities like sprinting or very heavy weightlifting. And ATP concentrations can be super compensated, so the levels are going to actually be elevated after being completely exhausted. So a 28% increase in creatine phosphate and an 18% increase in ATP can occur after 5 months of resistance training with 3 to 5 sets of 8 to 10 repetitions with 2 to minutes rest or less. And glycogen content has been shown to increase up to 112% with resistance training. And this is crazy good because this means that our energy systems when we train will be adapted to support that form of training. So we'll have more energy available, we can perform more resistance training, more volume with progressive overload. All of these things will get better. So our connective tissue can also be adapted with anaerobic training. And this is cool because when we exercise, we exert a lot of force on our bones, our tendons, our ligaments, our fascia, cartilage. Our body can sense this stress and we can actually adapt. So first up, we have bone. Wolff's law is basically states that bone is loaded, it will adapt to become stronger to resist that stress. This law can be used to fight conditions like osteopenia, osteoporosis, low bone mineral density, kind of all the same things. So when we age, or when we age not gracefully, we start poking holes in that bone, we withdraw calcium, we don't deposit enough calcium. So with progressive bone loading exercises, we can actually fight this disease state. So the rate of a bone can adapt depends on the ratio of that spongy trabecular bone to the cortical compact bone on the outside. So trabecular bone adapts more quickly because there's just that spongy surface area allows it to adapt with more surface area quicker. I don't know how else to say that, but it's less dense, more flexible, causing increased sensitivity to adaptation. And with bone, we think about minimal essential strain, which is basically saying there's a threshold we need to initiate new bone growth. So walking might not present enough strain on the bone to adapt for bone mineral density. So squats or sprinting may meet that threshold to grow. So depending on where you are and your level of activity, your bone mineral density, you'll have to adapt that minimal essential strain. And as the bone becomes stronger, more stress is actually required to stimulate growth, which is why we progressively load exercises, so we can get as much bone mineral density as we possibly can. And even if your goal is not to look like a bodybuilder, this concept is very important for you because as we age, if we are inactive, our bone matrix starts dissolving as it needs to be stimulated to stay the same or increase. So this will result in atrophy so severe, possibly, that sitting in a chair or sneezing, falling, can create bones to easily fracture. So bone fractures, especially as we age, are correlated with increased mortality, like dying. So we should probably pay attention to our bone mineral density. And in my belief, progressive resistance exercise should be implemented to age gracefully. Obviously, speak with your doctor if your situation might be medically complex or you think it might help. So specificity, again and again, specificity. Running will increase bone mineral density for the legs, but not the arms. So your body will only adapt when there is an intentional stimulus to grow. So running will not increase your bone density in your wrist. You'll need to lift weights for that. So how do we grow bone? It takes a long time to grow bone, like 6+ months. However, the process begins immediately, but bone growth, like significantly, will take a long time. So bone growth focused training should be loading, speed, direction of loading changes, because loading bones just axially is only one dimension that the stress lines can form the bone. So, we are 3-dimensional creatures. We should train in 3 dimensions so we can stress the bone in all different ways. So because it is a, structural component of our musculoskeletal system, we should use multi-joint exercises with the forces going through the hip and the spine with structural exercises. What I mean by that is like squats and deadlifts, clean and jerks, overhead pressing. This is because the load is transmitted through the spine and the hip, which is good for, total bone mineral density increases. So we should use a variety of exercises so that the bone faces novel stimuli to adapt. So we're not just doing one exercise, so we only get that one specific adaptation. To stimulate the bone, we should use machine-based exercises, isolation exercises in limitation or with caution, because they only isolate a single muscle group, which is not specific to the whole body. So you use body weight, free weight, such as push, jerk, deadlift, and shoulder press. So we can use a bunch of the musculature, a bunch of the joints at the same time, so we can overload a lot of the body. And bone health is multifactorial, just like your muscle cells, just like your nervous system. So exercise and loading is only one piece of the puzzle. Your hormones, your nutrition, hydration, sleep, overall health, they all contribute to having quality bone density. So I am just one component. You need to talk to your doctor, your nutritionist. If you're not getting the 7 to 9 hours, then it's something you should look into. So peak bone mass. When we meet peak bone mass between 25 and 30, after that we start slowly losing density after 40. This is a bummer, but with training, we can increase our peak, so we can start from a higher peak and decline more gracefully. So this could be the difference of when you are 40, if you perform resistance exercise, you load your bones, then you lose a certain percentage of your bone mineral density. So this could mean when you're 90, you have a fall. And if you had been progressively overloading your bone, you had been getting maintenance of your bone mineral density. When you fall at 90, your bone won't fracture, theoretically. And the reciprocal, if you don't train, you're osteoporotic. A fall might cause you to be immobile, to be in a wheelchair, to not be able to walk. Just not a good deal. So pay attention to your bone mineral density. But we have more than just bone. We have tendons, we have ligaments, we have fascia. Collagen makes up all this connective tissue. Pro-collagen is spun. It's 3 proteins twisted in a triple helix structure created by these cells called fibroblasts. But you don't need to know all that. You just need to know these strands of collagen make up your tendons, your ligaments. So your ligaments are there's very little oxygen in this tissue generally. So your ligaments connect bone to bone, such as your anterior cruciate ligament is a ligament, and it connects your femur to your tibia, bone to bone. And it contains elastin and collagen to allow a little bit of stretch. Too much stretch, you have a popped ACL, you go to physical therapy, you get it repaired, and it doesn't heal very well because this tissue is not very vascular, so there's not enough blood flow. But tendons, on the other hand, connects muscle to bone, such as your biceps tendon and your elbow. Some places have okay vascular blood flow, circulation, causing poor regeneration and healing if an injury happens, though all of these things might get better just depending on where it is in the body. Fascia is fibrous connective tissue that surrounds and separates skeletal muscle. So every layer of, so there's muscle cells, and these are wrapped in fascia or endomysium, and bundles of collagen are arranged in different planes throughout the muscle. So you have a muscle cell, you have bundles of muscle cells, you have the whole muscle, they're all wrapped in fascia, and they converge to form that tendon at the end of the muscle, which is super cool. So your fascia basically wraps around your fibers, your muscle, so that you can create mechanical advantage with the tendon. Pretty cool. And cartilage is dense connective tissue, provides smooth joint surfaces, such as hyaline cartilage in your knee. This is so cool, and cartilage acts as like a shock absorber. So when you're sprinting, you're running, that hyaline cartilage is just a surface for your knee to not be bone on bone. That cartilage is a shock absorber, and it's also in our discs in the spine. So it's important that we move because cartilage lacks its own blood supply. That means it heals very poorly in the case of an injury, but nutrients can arrive from the joint through things like synovial fluid. And what synovial fluid is just fluid in the joint, has some nutrients, and the only way it can get to the cartilage is with movement. So movement kind of rhythmically bathes the synovial fluid over the tissue, causing healing. And immobilization of a joint yields poor diffusion of oxygen and nutrients, causing cell death. Very bad. So this is the use it or lose it phenomena. So with disuse, cartilage will thin. Let's avoid that if we can. And how do we actually adapt our connective tissue? Really just focus on progressive overload safely, stimulate growth with external resistance through the full range of motion. So low intensity will not change collagen because we need a significant intensity. Again, our body is very greedy. It doesn't want to spend resources it does not need to spend. So adaptations occur between the tendon or the ligament and their bone attachment with the body of the tendon and the fascia over the muscle. So this can all be adapted as we become stronger. Our bones will pull, the muscle will pull on the bone with more force, causing the connective tissue like the bone and the tendon to adapt physically, to get stronger, to have more collagen diameter, to have more bonds between the crosslinks between the collagen, and the density of the fibers themselves can actually increase. So as we stimulate muscle growth, connective tissue will also adapt to withstand the increased force capacity. So for example, a 15 to 19% increase in Achilles tendon force transmission was found after 8 weeks of resistance training. And that might not seem like very significant, but 15 to 19% increase in tendon force transmission means that if you are a soccer player, you can be 15 to 19% more vigorous with your Achilles tendon without a rupture after 8 weeks. So that's kind of how I see it. So you should be training eccentrically to get the most benefit in your tendons. So next up we have the endocrine system. The endocrine system has to do with our hormones, and these regulate many functions in the body. Anaerobic exercise provides a stimuli for many body systems to adapt, including our hormone system. So the acute response to anabolic hormones is after we train anaerobically at a high intensity, we will elevate our testosterone, our growth hormone, and cortisol. They've all been found to increase for up to 30 minutes in men. And a larger release of hormones will occur if there's greater muscle mass recruited to perform compound movements with high intensity with a short rest interval. So that's kind of the recipe to adapt most systems, is a high intensity moderate volume, short rest periods. It's all good for you. Insulin-like growth factor, IGF-1, is released with exercise. And it's the hormonal messenger that stimulates cells to adapt. So it targets skeletal muscle, cartilage, and bone, and it says, "Hey, let's grow a little bit." So that's kind of like growth hormone released when you sleep, but IGF-1 is released and growth hormone with exercise. And hormones have a delayed response with exercise, so the cell is stressed and hormones are released to respond to that stress over time. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. Exercise 1 hour later, you'll have this effect. Because we have chronic responses to acute hormone stimulation. So long-term training causes systemic changes in the body. So resistance training can increase muscular force production, and hormones play a role in this. And as exercise intensity is tolerated, the body adapts to become more resilient, and part of that adaptation has to do with hormones. So resting hormone adaptations are unlikely to change chronically. Like testosterone, IGF-1, cortisol probably won't increase resting levels, because resting levels don't account for receptor concentrations and the hormone concentration inside of the cells. However, blood concentrations likely represent the current stresses imposed by things like nutrition, exercise intensity, and just overall life stress. Like if you're going through things, your cortisol levels might fluctuate with your stress levels. So if levels are chronically elevated, the receptor would downregulate with sustained exposure. And this is because you kind of have this relationship with concentrations of hormones. When they're elevated, you're chronically, so you have a high concentration of this hormone. The receptors that respond to that hormone will be downregulated because they've reduced their receptor sensitivity. This is the reason why, like, steroid users, like competitive bodybuilders, they use steroids in cycles so that their receptors don't necessarily lose that sensitivity. So that's why they do that, so that they can maintain receptor health hygiene. Receptor hormones can also change. So when we train, we upregulate receptors within 48 to 72 hours. So it's kind of cool, kind of complicated. But for example, like 1 set versus 6 sets of 10 repetitions of squat exercises causes a higher volume in the 6 set group, obviously. It downregulates the receptors. But with nutrition modulation, so by consuming protein and carbohydrates, our body's like, okay, we can handle the stress. So it actually attenuates the downregulation of those receptors, allowing us to do more, which is also good, because more is more adaptation, more resilience to stress. So we can also adapt our cardiovascular and respiratory system with anaerobic training. So to sustain activity with increasing intensity, the heart and lungs must adapt. Heavy resistance training stimulates increased tolerance for high pressure environments. So we're going to go into the cardiovascular system. So with anaerobic training, the heart is a muscle that pumps blood, and with each pump of blood, it ejects a certain volume or stroke volume from it, and that increases the total output of the cardiovascular system. Cardiac output increases, blood pressure increases acutely with exercise. So for instance, a heart rate of 170 beats per minute and blood pressure of 320 over 250 millimeters of mercury has been found with heavy leg pressing. That is a immense stress on the cardiovascular system, but it's okay. It's okay because it's exercise, it's not resting. So those numbers might be scary. Hey, let's go to the ER if you weren't exercising. But that's what's cool about exercise. It can adapt the system over time to build resilience. But blood pressure increases non-linearly with the amount of muscle recruited, especially in the concentric phase. So if you can imagine being at the bottom of a squat and then going from eccentric to concentric, that sticking point, that's where you're going to get those crazy high blood pressure values. So stroke volume, cardiac output increase during the eccentric phase, particularly with the addition of the Valsalva maneuver. What is the Valsalva maneuver? It's basically when you brace down, if someone's going to punch you in the stomach, and you close your glottis, your throat muscle, and you brace your core, you get really tight. That's going to increase the blood pressure in your body. And lifters do this sometimes to increase pressure to protect their spine. But after the completion of a set, heart rate is actually higher than during the set itself. And this is because the body must pay off that oxygen debt for the intense work. So it's got to actually pump blood to reduce that energy deficit, or that oxygen debt from the energy that it had to produce during the set itself, anaerobically. So what's interesting about that is that the aerobic system, so when you're breathing in between sets, your ventilation and that kind of thing will actually increase. The amount of breaths you take a minute will increase in between your sets higher than during the set. This is because you're aerobically paying off the debt that you accrued when you were lifting. So kind of cool. Blood flow is also directed to the working muscle depending on the intensity, the duration, and the size of the muscle recruited, which means there can be 5 to 20 times increased cardiac output with exercise. Most of this blood is going to be sent to active muscles, which means they are extremely needy for blood, especially during exercise, high intense exercise specifically. And we have a concept called reactive hyperemia. So this is where muscle contractions greater than 20% of max contraction impedes blood flow to the periphery, and this is the response of like a rush of blood during rest. And this is the theory seen in like blood flow restriction studies. So where they restrict blood flow, and then when you remove the restriction, a bunch of growth factors, a bunch of nutrients goes to the muscle to stimulate hypertrophy. So this is something I've actually seen as a student physical therapist. People use blood flow restriction. They do a little bit of intensity, and they can stimulate hypertrophy with very little stimulus, which is kind of cool. Cardio adaptations at rest. So I will say that anaerobic training, so like weightlifting, is not the best for cardiovascular adaptations. They really hammered that in school, but I will say that there is a small noticeable change in heart rate, blood pressure, stroke volume, which we'll talk about. So short-term resistance training can reduce heart rate by 5 to 12% or not at all. So a little bit of heart rate adaptation, because when you strain the system, you may get a little reduction in resting heart rate. So that just means you're more efficient. Though, like, obviously, if you're doing high intensity interval training or cardiovascular exercise, this will go down a ton, which I think you should do both. So you get the best of both worlds, which we'll talk about later. But blood pressure will actually decrease 2 to 4% with resistance training, with the largest effect seen if you are inactive and you actually have a high starting blood pressure. And stroke volume is the concept of increases, stroke volume is when you eject blood from your heart muscle. It can increase because your heart will have to hypertrophy, get larger to resist the blood pressure that is imposed on it. So this means that more blood is ejected every heartbeat. Cardiac hypertrophy increases, like I just said. So the left ventricle will hypertrophy, it'll thicken. The interventricular septum will hypertrophy or thicken with exercise, because those high blood pressures we discussed. So this is a positive adaptation. We want this to happen. We don't want this to happen at rest with like pathological cardiology states. But in diastolic volume, so with systole, we're contracting. With diastole, we're relaxing. So the in diastolic volume, which is the amount of blood in the ventricular chamber before systole or ejection occurs. This will increase in bodybuilders, but not in weightlifters. So why does this occur? This could be high volume training that bodybuilders use, or it could be confounded by supplementary like cardiovascular exercise that bodybuilders do to maintain their body fat goals. So whatever the case, you may get some small benefits in those areas. So adaptations of the cardiovascular response to anaerobics. So chronic resistance training blunts the increase of heart rate, of blood pressure, and rate pressure product with adaptation to the workload. So this just means that we won't have to stress as much when we train because we're used to it. We don't have to strain as much to do the same thing because we get more efficient at it. So bodybuilders have been found to have less blood pressure when training compared to sedentary populations. And this may be due to slightly higher oxygen use with high volumes and short rest periods, or it could be due to reduced afterload due to stronger ventricular ejections with each heartbeat. That just means that your heart gets a little bit more efficient with training. So ventilatory responses to anaerobic exercise. This is just saying when we breathe differently when we're exercising, when we're trained, than when we don't. So ventilation is the air we breathe in order to get oxygen to our tissues for energy. So the ventilation rate is increased while training, but is also elevated more during rest periods as we recover. So shorter rest periods of 30 to 60 seconds will yield the most ventilation or oxygen debt. So we'll have to breathe more to recover. So other adaptations also include increased tidal volume and breathing frequency. So this is just more oxygen in the system with training. And interestingly, submaximal effort, tidal volume remains elevated. So this means that we breathe more oxygen at submax intensity, owing to true ventilatory adaptation with a resistance training stimulus. That's really cool. So ventilatory equivalent is basically the ratio of air ventilated, so breathed in, to consume oxygen by the tissues. So this is reduced, demonstrating an efficiency as we train. So less oxygen is required to be breathed in for the same amount of oxygen or for the oxygen consumed in our body. So we get more efficient at using oxygen. We don't have to breathe in as much. So aerobic and anaerobic training. So resistance training helps the performance of aerobic athletes. So aerobic athletes get benefits like strength, power, enzymes that anaerobic training provides. High volume aerobics, so marathon running, may decrease a little bit of that power and strength in our resistance athletes. And this is only relevant, in my opinion, for those who compete like as Olympians or as power athletes. But in my opinion, of course, the benefits of cardiovascular health outweigh the decrement in power output you're exposing yourself to. So I believe in a combination of aerobic and anaerobic training for the best adaptations possible. So we're going to sum up some anaerobic adaptations here in the last quarter. So muscular strength training may cause a 40% strength increase in the untrained. This is a crazy high number, 40% stronger in the untrained. So this is super cool. This means if you've never lifted before, you should try it out. Get you stronger. So this is likely due to the motor learning first and then hypertrophy. A 20% increase in strength in moderately trained, a 16% increase was seen in trained. It just keeps going. 2% with elite participants was noted with just a training bout. So with training, a shift from 2X to 2A fibers demonstrates greater fatigue resistance at similar force outputs. We get more efficient at using muscle. Power can also be adapted with anaerobic training. So power is body weight, or body weight is the best way to train for power. If you're thinking about jump squats, where the speed component is emphasized, some sources say 30 to 60% of 1 rep max is the optimal rate to produce power. And peak power in a squat was found to be maximized at around 56% of a 1 rep max, while power cleans are closer to 80% of 1 rep max. So this is just saying power can be adapted depending on the movement, But first, let's actually define what power is. Just speed. So training with speed and recruiting speed and power and strength very quickly. So that meant a whole lot of basically just saying that we want to speed up our movements. We need to train with explosiveness. So local muscular endurance is the concept of anaerobic training generating fatigue and metabolites inside your muscle cell. So in response to this metabolic stress, there is improved buffering capacity. Mitochondrial and capillary numbers will also increase. Metabolic enzyme buffering activity increases. So this basically just improves the amount of endurance we have at a certain intensity of anaerobic training. So body composition has been shown to change, which a lot of people would like to change their body composition for health reasons, for aesthetic reasons, but basically resistance training increases fat-free mass, so muscle tissue, and it might reduce body fat up to 9%. This is a pretty significant shift because anaerobic exercise builds a lean mass. Lean mass happens to be metabolically expensive, which is just fancy to say it uses more energy, it uses more donuts to burn, to move, to survive. So by having more muscle, we burn more energy, which means our body composition improves a little bit. So aerobic capacity can change. So in the untrained, there might be a slight increase in VO2 max with anaerobic training. In untrained, slightly trained, there is a very slight or not significant impact. But circuit training, obviously, with very long periods of high intensity, very little rest, will improve heart rate, VO2 max with short rest periods and large volumes. So motor learning, we know that as we move, we stimulate our nervous system to move more efficiently. Resistance training has been shown to increase the efficiency or economy of things like running, jumping, kicking. We just learn how to be more efficient with our nervous system. And programming anaerobics and aerobics together. So there's some interference effect, like I just said. If you're a power athlete, maybe consider not training for marathons. In my opinion, cardiovascular health is more important to a minimal increase in power. So overtraining. Overtraining is the concept that frequency, volume, intensity can all cause overtraining if they're dialed too high. So overtraining can be combated with rest, sleep, nutrition, health, injury, status, stress, recovery. They all play a role in preventing overtraining. But overtraining is not all bad. So overreaching or functional overreaching, FOR, is short-term decrease in performance with increased intensity. And some plan this intentionally before a rest period or a taper to allow a supercompensation in performance. So, however, with poor programming and insufficient recovery, this leads to non-functional overreaching in FOR, and this occurs when athletes cannot recover from extreme training, causing decreased performance for weeks or months. And this leads to overtraining syndrome. So with prolonged stress, this can occur. You might notice burnout, overwork, stale, just feeling fatigued, inability to sustain high intensity exercise when training load is maintained. So you just feel bad. You just feel terrible. Many might be caused by progressive overloading too quickly. Overtraining syndrome may last as long as 6 months. But we can, once we know about it, we might be able to prevent it. So there are two types of overtraining syndrome. Sympathetic overtraining syndrome is the one that occurs first, most likely. And this is your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight response. So you might have heard about this. So when you get scared or you're running away from, a very angry lion, your heart rate increases, your breathing rate increases, you move blood away from your digestive system to your musculature so you can, fight that lion. But this sympathetic overtraining system will cause you to burn out real quick. And it causes parasympathetic overtraining syndrome, which is basically an increased parasympathetic nervous system at rest with exercise. And this might sound good, but if you think about what the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest, does, it causes chronic suppression of our body systems. So we just want to sleep. It causes decreased performance. So sleep and emotional systems symptoms may occur with increased risk of infection. So like your immune system is vulnerable. You don't want to eat as much. You have to exert yourself a lot to do the same level of training you did before. Hormonal signs of overtraining. So there'll be a blunted response with growth hormone, ACTH, LH, FSH. They all kind of change in response to overtraining. Decreased testosterone and IGF-1 might occur, with causing worse recovery. Never good. So just be aware of these negative side effects, and that's why we should pay attention to how we feel and not to progress our training. So there's also the psychology of overtraining. So mood and community involvement can be markers of overtraining. So poor confidence, depression, irritability, fatigue, program. If you're experiencing any of this, the program should be evaluated that you're on for just too much stimulus. Your home life, your community involvement might lead to depression. So a referral to a healthcare professional may be warranted if you're having those significant signs. And the reverse of that is detraining. So this refers to the decrease in performance when training ends. So this causes muscle loss, reduction in capillary density, bone mineral density. So this is the principle of reversibility, the last principle we will discuss today. And it states training adaptations can only be held with continual stimulus or training. Strength is maintained for up to 4 weeks of inactivity. In athletes, peak performance with eccentric force and sport-specific power might decline a little faster. But the good news is that 2 weeks will not change your strength significantly, but 2 to 3 months, the strength might be decreased by as much as 10% due to neural atrophy and also atrophy of the muscles themselves. So muscle fibers can also decrease CSA by about 6% in 2 weeks, just a little bit. I mean, that's kind of significant, but not crazy. But detraining of 7 months, you're looking at 37% atrophy of fibers. That was seen in powerlifters. So all of these things hopefully give you the tools to be better, be healthier, to meet your goals, to avoid overtraining and injury. And I hope you learned something, and I appreciate y'all for listening. See y'all in the next one. Peace.